Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler. Watch brands big and small often express how proud they are to launch a new product, whether something as simple as a strap or as complex as an entirely new movement. Of course, new movements are there to make a brand stand out with new features, technical specifications to wow a potential customer, and revisions to show that a brand is still very much looking forward. However, sometimes these innovations can go badly wrong, and whether in the short or long term, can seriously affect the brands which birthed them. In recent memory, more than a few brands have made the error of overreaching with a new movement. Back in 2019, Heuer attempted to revive its famous Autavia with the isograph, an entirely new execution which was to be neither a chronograph nor a cockpit instrument, the only two forms previously taken by the Autavia collection. Instead, this three-hand watch was designed to be the ultimate every-purpose watch from a brand which, after all, generally appeals to fewer collectors and more people looking simply for a nice watch. In this aim, the isograph used an essentially unmodified ETA 2824 automatic Swiss movement with one critical addition, a carbon composite balance spring to give serious resistance to magnetism whilst avoiding the use of patent-controlled silicon springs. To give this watch the very best of chances, Heuer really went the whole hog, with former technical director Guy Simon giving interviews on the spring's functionality. Rather unfortunately, a month or so after delivery to authorised dealers, Heuer realised that the spring simply didn't work, thus precipitating a complete recall. But the movement I'd like to discuss didn't appear in 2019, but in 1968, and according to some, almost single-handedly set its manufacturer back by 2 decades in relation to its competitors, including Rolex, who simply walked away, technologically speaking. You see, the subject of this video is none other than the Omega Calibre 1000 series, the movements which had the unenviable task of taking over from the magnificent and widely revered 550 series Omega movements of the 1960s, the movements which powered the famous Omega Seamaster 300, amongst many others. Nowadays, despite powering an estimated 1.5 million watches, the 1000 series movement is seen as a bit of a dog, and the movement which brought a lower standard of quality and poor reliability to one of the very best names in the business, whilst encouraging them to scrap in-house movements altogether. Yet after fairly extensive research, I reckon that this movement has been done a serious disservice and deserves to be revisited as a story of ineffective marketing and poor judgment, but which actually yielded a very, very important movement for the brand. To really understand why this movement was so important, we first must look at the brand which produced it. Omega is a company for which I have enormous respect, particularly for their efforts between the 1940s and the 70s. You see, after that point, Omega essentially lost 2 decades during which its simple ETA movements and comparably underwhelming watches allowed Rolex to leave it behind, and it's only been in recent years that Omega has started to reclaim the ground it lost. Launched in 1968, Omega's 1000 series came at a very important time. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, this brand had competed with the likes of Rolex's chronometer movements, and on many occasions was seen as the brand producing better designed, better finished, and altogether more elevated timepieces mechanically. In particular, whilst Rolex placed a considerable emphasis on pragmatic, simple engineering, Omega was more romantic, so to speak, and followed brands like Longines into chronometry competitions as a symbol of proper Swiss watchmaking. In particular, Omega's 500 and 550 series movements, the 560s and 750s also fall into this category as date and day-date variants, respectively, of the 550, continue to be seen as true technical marvels combining beautiful finishing with wonderful old-school touches like a swan neck regulator and sturdy, high accuracy. To a great extent, one could also assign these movements fame to the watches they inhabited and the breadth of the market they commanded. At the time, these movements were marvels of versatility, with date, no date and chronometer options allowing Omega's exquisite Gerald Gender-designed pie-pan constellations sitting on the wrists of oil executives to share in essence the same movements with the Seamaster 300s, perhaps worn by those working on their pipelines. Between the two, these movements prove their absolute toughness and quality by being riveted to the exterior of an aircraft in the form of a Seamaster dress watch in the heyday of commercial flight, just to prove a point. Even so, these movements were aging. Whilst reliably accurate, they lacked the features which would define the modern mechanical watch, including hacking seconds, a 4 Hz beat rate, and the capacity to, if needed, be mass-produced. These movements instead offered a more leisurely 19,800 vibration per hour beat rate, that's 5.5 ticks per second, no hacking, and a beautiful but hardly forward-looking style of construction. The problem here was that in order to make them reliable and accurate, a lot of time and effort had to be poured into every stage of production. By the late 1960s, Omega wanted to change their philosophy and produce a high-beat, automatic three-hand movement for the bulk of their watches. The objective was to have a high-beat movement, that's 8 ticks per second, with a decent power reserve, hacking, and a more reasonable cost of production. The problem was that Omega tried an impossible triad: cost-cutting whilst furnishing a movement with absolutely every innovation it could reasonably accept, and above all, changing the general view of what an Omega movement should be. If you're enjoying this video, please remember to like, share and subscribe to always catch the latest videos and to make sure that the episodes can keep coming. Also, if you want to stay abreast of new articles on watchchronicler.com, new podcasts and new videos, follow Watch Chronicler on Instagram. Thank you. On the face of things, the choice to make a high-beat movement for the time was an understandable one. Omega had been known for its excellent quality and, for the most part, the higher frequency would deliver greater stability, thus making them easier to regulate to a higher level of accuracy. Of course, some have wondered why Omega didn't develop their existing 550 movements, themselves developments of earlier movements, into a high-beat option. Quite aside from the need for a bigger mainspring and a different automatic winding system to supply energy, Omega also seemed to want to keep its options open for the possibility of less labour-intensive mass production. This, by the way, isn't intended as a snub, but the acceptance that these movements in altered form found their way as far down the food chain as Tissot. When one stops to consider the broader picture, a movement with the specifications to beat competitors whilst increasing revenue would be a powerful motivator for anyone. What I do find rather telling though is that Omega chose to develop a totally new movement rather than adapting an older one, as was the case with the Lemania 1873, or more famously known as the Omega 861 developed Calibre 1040 in their first automatic Speedmasters. This movement succeeded in being reliable, having a 25% higher beat rate than the movement which spawned it, and having automatic winding, but was ruinously expensive to make and to service. That's the fact which proves for me just what an important part affordability was in the 1000 series movement equation. Unfortunately, the triad which I mentioned earlier really took its toll on the whole project. The most initially obvious reason to disapprove of this movement was its apparent step back in relation to the sheer beauty of its predecessors. Prior to the 1000, Omega's automatic movements looked, to be quite honest, far too ornate to sit inside something as vulgar as a dive watch. They had delightfully shaped rotors, swan neck regulators, a very rich rose gold finish, and endless variation in polished, brushed and spiraled componentry. By comparison, the 1000 series movements had none of this elegance, with a very pedestrian and reportedly poorly applied finish, a rotor which looked like it had been taken from a parts bin, and a basic regulating system. Even so, ugly though the 1000 was to many people, I fear that many assumed that its appearance was purely the product of cost savings. In truth, its looks signalled the very nucleus of the 1000's problems, since they were also a product of trying to keep the movement as slender as possible, a very reasonable aim. If the original Calibres 1000, 1001 and 1002 were known for one shortcoming, it was their problematic automatic winding system. Yet when one breaks down the order of issues experienced, it seems almost inconceivable that Omega didn't pick up on the problem early on. You see, in order to wind an automatic watch, a rotor moves due to gravity and the momentum it continues to carry from the movement of an owner's wrist. Now, I've already mentioned that a high beat movement requires a bigger and stronger spring to function, and in turn, this requires more energy to fully wind. There are a few different ways in which this can be achieved. The first is to fit a bigger, heavier rotor, which can be geared to wind the spring in fewer rotations because its very nature delivers more torque. The flip side, though, is that this torque has to go through a whole range of gears, including the famously troublesome reversers, and if you apply more torque, wear and the chances of actually damaging something is going to increase. Therefore, Omega went for a different principle by having a slimmer, lighter rotor, a benefit to the movement thinness, and geared it to take rather a few more turns to fully wind the spring. The problem was that this didn't actually solve the wear issues inherent to a more powerful mainspring in their entirety, whilst also reducing the watch's winding efficiency. But here's where I wonder if this movement series' undeniable shortcomings have been overstated. You see, the watch's automatic winding efficiency is anecdotally complained about, but I can't actually find any example of the second generation movements, that's to say the 1011 series movements with more jewels and technical revisions, actually showing these problems. In reality, I wonder if these movements were the victims of the wear patterns of the times instead. You see, the 1000 series movement was designed to be a jack of all trades, in the same way as its predecessors were. In the spirit of this, it appeared in everything from elegant, gold constellation chronometers to the remarkable Seamaster Ploprof. It was also a movement designed to be more industrial than its predecessors, yet in truth actually required more careful maintenance. This was likely a combination of two factors, and do have a look in the description of this video because I've included the sources which prove very helpful to figuring all of this out. The first was that with a higher beat rate came more wear to pivots and bearings, yet in a sense, this was a consequence of the second problem. Omega was only really able to offer this beat rate due to new synthetic oils and lubricants. These were and still are a fantastic option because after a few years, they simply degrade and disappear. By contrast, a traditional natural oil will gum up a movement as it ages and force a service. Consequently, to a wearer who perhaps only sent his watch to be serviced when it needed to be, or when he perceived that to be the case, the new movement would continue running soundly, whilst, unbeknownst to him, would start to wear itself apart. This specific reason is why, for many owners of the 1970s Omega watches which employed the later variants of this movement family, either from the outset or after a service, the watches never posed the slightest problem. It's in this light that one can begin to wonder if these movements were, in actual fact, rather cruelly maligned in the years after their discontinuation. Of course, this movement was, in part, responsible for an awful lot of Omega's woes, including the fact that between the mid-1970s and 1984, when this movement was discontinued in all forms, Omega's development of three-hand watches was essentially stalled. The result was the use of ETA-based movements from the mid-1980s until the mid-2000s, and more importantly, the loss of Omega's hard-earned mechanical prestige. With that being said, this change of tack for Omega was just as obviously caused by the downturn suffered by the Swiss watch industry in the second half of the 1970s, as in 1981, SSIH, the group which owned Omega, had to be saved from bankruptcy. In 1983, Omega had new ownership and plenty of new incentive to cut costs. So if these movements clearly weren't a wild success, but also weren't the unmitigated disaster anecdotal evidence would suggest, how should we remember them? Well, consider this. If you buy a 1970s Omega, be it a Constellation or a Seamaster 120, what will immediately be obvious, and which simply couldn't have been in period, is that it has an awful lot more in common with a modern ETA movement than anything Omega made in the 1960s. Glorious though those movements are, their low beat rate, jittery seconds, lack of hacking and overall operation give a slight touch of frailty. Viscerally, a 1000 series movement is a much, much more modern device, and if that's what you're used to and prefer, you simply can't beat one. Beyond that, you also have to remember that whether you have a Calibre 1011, the first really working variant, or a 1022, the last proper variant, you have on your wrist Omega's answer to a changing world in the 70s when Swiss watchmaking was on the brink of destruction. So whether encased in gold in the boardroom or 200 metres under the sea in a diving bell, this series of movement was Omega's final stand for in-house movements, and that, in this journalist's opinion, merits a certain recognition. But what do you think of the Omega Calibre 1000? Was it a woeful way for Omega's in-house movement production to end, or was it a movement with some merit? Let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, subscribe, and to hit the bell icon to always catch the latest episodes. Thank you very much for watching. This is Armon from WatchChronicler.com. Out.